All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. You've logged on to the Regulatory Compliance Associates and Nelson Labs webinar, End-to-End Human Factors for Medical Devices and Reprocessing Usability Testing. Now, if you missed one of our webinars or simply would like to refer to one, you can always find them on either the RCA or Nelson Labs websites on the on-demand webinars page listed under resources. You can also receive notifications for upcoming live webinars and on-demand webinars by signing up for either of our newsletters or following us on LinkedIn. Regulatory Compliance Associates, a Nelson Labs company, provides comprehensive regulatory quality and compliance consulting services to the pharmaceutical, biologics, sterile compounding, and medical device industries. With a team of more than 500 global experts, RCA helps life science organizations navigate complex FDA and international regulations, develop and maintain robust quality systems, and remediate compliance challenges. From inspection readiness and regulatory submissions to product development and post-market support, RCA partners with the clients across the product lifecycle to ensure safety, efficacy, and compliance. Nelson Labs is a leading global provider of lab testing and expert advisory services for medtech and pharmaceutical companies. Nelson Labs performs over 900 rigorous microbiological and analytical laboratory tests across medical device, pharma, and protective barrier industries. The experts at Nelson know every test matters and requires solutions to excuse me. The experts at Nelson Lab know every test matters and requires solutions to complex problems to improve patient outcomes and minimize client risk. Together, RCA and Nelson deliver an integrated end-to-end solution for medical device manufacturers, combining world-class laboratory testing with expert regulatory and quality consulting. Together, we support products from development through commercialization and post-market compliance, helping manufacturers reduce risk, accelerate timelines, and meet global regulatory expectations. Now, let's get started. Today, we're joined by Jessica Schaeferman and Christelle Lloyd. Jessica Schaeferman is a biomedical engineer, project management professional, and a certified usability analyst with over 20 years of experience across class 1 to 3 medical devices, including sterile and combination products. And Christelle brings extensive experience in the healthcare reprocessing, regulatory expectations, and reprocessing validation, supporting global initiatives at Nelson Labs. Together, they shall share practical insights to help medical device manufacturers navigate reprocessing and usability expectations with confidence. Today's webinar will begin with a brief overview of what human factors are and why it matters. We'll then walk through how human factors is applied throughout design and development, including what's typically included in a human factors file. From there, we'll focus specifically on what considerations for reusable and reprocessed products, followed by an overview of how human factor studies are conducted. We'll close with key takeaways and practical insights that you can apply right away, and we'll leave time at the end for any questions to discuss. You can submit your questions at any time in the questions box, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. Now, to begin today's presentation, I turn it over to Jessica.
Hi, everyone. So let's get right into it. What are we here to talk about today? Today we're talking about human factors. Next slide, please, Brandon. What is human factors? The reason we gather here. It is commonly referred to as human factors engineering, also called usability engineering. It is a stepwise process. It spans the entire product realization process for medical devices, where each step is documented and controlled as part of the design file. The goal of human factors engineering or usability engineering is to minimize use errors and the associated risks that are associated with use of medical devices. It helps ensure safe and effective use for the intended users in the intended use environment based on the intended use of the device itself. So from a high level, what we're going to talk about today is covered largely in these standards and guidances, namely 62366, which is the application of usability engineering to medical devices, which does cover the entire process and the contents of an HFE file. But the FDA has also released several guidances associated with human factors or usability that will also be touched on while we go through this today. It's worth noting, however, that 62366 and the FDA guidances also tie this process into a 14971 risk management process and risk management file, as well as your 13485 design and development files. So those two things should not be left segregated on their own. So as I said on the first slide, we can move on. It's a stepwise process. It starts at concept and goes all the way through post-market. Similar to risk management, it fits into a normal product realization process that's outlined in 13485 and the typical design controls process, or a phase gate development process. Okay. The product of human factors engineering processes or usability engineering process is the HFE file. These deliverables and contents of the HFE file overlap a lot with typical design and development file or design control deliverables. Some of them can be used synonymously. Some of them should be documented separately. This is up to you and your process, but these are the typical deliverables that you would find as part of an HFE file. And here you can see we've broken them down into a typical phase gate type of release process, including a usability engineering plan and a use specification, the hazard analysis and the user interface requirements, a user interface specification, which is different than a use specification, the HF formative evaluations, which includes both protocols and reports, and a use-related risk analysis, which I'll call a URRA several times throughout this procedure or throughout this webinar, and then your HF validation study. These are also called summative studies. And then the whole HFE file usually gets summarized in an HFE summary report. So let's break those down into a little bit more detail. In the planning phase of a new development project, you always want to ensure that you're following your company's procedures and work instructions. So you should have a procedure or work instruction that outlines how you conduct the HFE process. So we want to make sure that whatever process you're following, however it's incorporated into the design and development process, et cetera, is all outlined within an SOP that you have on file for your company. And the first thing you do is a HFE plan or a usability plan. The plan should outline your deliverables for the file, how you're going to control them, who's going to approve them, where they'll be documented, define the resources and responsibilities. Do you know you're going to need to outsource any of this, or who is going to be in charge of ensuring maybe external vendors get testing done, or if you know you're going to need to utilize clinical resources or something like that. That should be defined in your plan. Plan for formative and summative studies. Now, this early in a project, you might not know that exactly, but at least put in the plan when you will make those testing decisions, including, at which phase of prototype creation you might want to evaluate with some representative users or something like that. And then you can include your HFE plan within an overarching design and development plan, or you can document it separately. That is up to you and your procedures. During the planning phase, it's also good to put down on paper your use specification. Now, as I said, this use specification is different than the user interface specification. So in a use specification is where you define the intended use of the device, This is the same statement that you would normally put in an IFU or something like that. You define your intended users with some detail. So you're going to define not only that it's a doctor, but what type of doctor, what type of training would they have, what parts of the world are they in, what are their language restrictions or whatnot. If your users are patients or home users, you want to ensure that you define their disease state, what limitations, physical or mental, they may have, what kind of education level would they typically have, things like that. You also want to define all users, not just end users. So think about anybody else who may need to interact with this device. Think about the biomedical engineering staff at a hospital. If your device is used in a hospital, will they need to calibrate this or service this? Will there be updates that they might need to load or things like that? They would be a user group. Reprocessing is another user group if it needs to be cleaned or re-sterilized. Patients as well as caregivers may be two separate user groups. If the patient has significant limitations, they may have caregivers in the home with them that need to use the device. So you really want to think through at this point who will interact with this device, and then define their use environments. So don't just say at home, but say at home in a bathroom maybe, or with a counter or well-lit room, or will it be noisy? Will it be quiet? What will the other distractions in the room be? Will it be a busy room? And then using that information, intended use, the intended user groups, and the use environments, think through the use scenarios. It's best to just write these down early. You can always come back and revise this as you learn more, but document your use scenarios for each user group in their use environments. What will they need to do? How will they approach the device? What will the device look like, be set up as, etc. And just do a process flow or task analysis, or even at this point, a bulleted list of steps. Anything will help you to think through the usability process. And then we go into the design input phase. So in design input phase, this is like the research phase of your project. So we're going to gather as much information as we can to define what we need this device to do, be, act as, etc. Good place to start with this is to identify potential use errors and hazardous situations. This can be done by researching similar devices, right? Look at their labeling, see what they list as their warnings and precautions. Those are very good indications of potential use errors and potential hazardous situations. You can use literature searches. Adverse events databases are great sources of this because use errors are commonly reported with adverse events, excuse me. You also, at this phase, are defining your user requirements, sometimes called user needs, and you're defining all of your design input requirements, the engineering level, testable, unambiguous requirements, and some of those will be related to the user interface. This will be requirements about screen size or buttons or colors, things of that nature. These are all the engineering level requirements of aspects of your user interface. Those all get documented at this phase as well. And then using this information, you can complete your initial URA. Risk assessments, like all 14971 risk assessments, you start them early and you rev them often, right? So with your URA, use that task analysis that you did as part of your use specification, go through each task or step that every user group might do, define how they could do it wrong or what would happen if they don't do that step, identify which use errors or hazardous situations apply to each step, and then determine which ones could result in harm to a patient. You can give it a severity score. You can identify your mitigations or potential mitigations. Do you want to add warnings to your labeling? Do you want to provide training materials Or do you want to design the device to eliminate something? This can all be captured in a URA. It's good rule of thumb to trace your mitigations to a design input requirement, because design input requirements all get verified. They don't get forgotten or left off the bottom. So if you can trace it to a DIR or make a new DIR for any new requirements you have for mitigations, if say you identify a mitigation that you're going to add a warning or add a sticker to the front of the device, make a design input requirement for that sticker. And then at this point, now that you know your risks, you know your steps, you should be able to start planning those formative and summative human factor studies. You can now say, okay, once we have the prototype developed to this phase, we should do an initial formative study just to confirm that your mitigations that you thought would mitigate use errors do and are understandable by representative users. Those would be formative evaluations. You do those iteratively. But at this point, you should be able to make a plan, and then you can update your human factors plan for what formative evaluations you're going to do and when you will be ready for your summative study. And then you move into your development phase. This is where you're actually defining the design of the device. You are actually putting things into drawings and specifications. You are establishing manufacturing processes and things like that. During the development phase is when you conduct your formative evaluations. You can conduct evaluations on early prototypes, or think about low fidelity like wireframes of screenshots or things like that to evaluate, does a user understand what this screen is telling them for software types of devices? Or can our representative users grip this device adequately to press buttons? Can they reach this with their fingers? Does this make sense to them? You can also do early formative studies with your labeling, including IFUs, training materials, warning stickers, things like that. Does it make sense to the users? These are informal evaluations. They don't need to be large size samples, and they don't need to be super overly controlled. They can be sort of free and have a lot of qualitative discussions and things like that in them, but you should always have a protocol and a report for them. If you don't document it, you didn't do it, essentially. So in order to take credit for doing these formative evaluations and incorporating this into your human factors process, you want to make sure you have protocols and reports for all of them. And at this point during the development phase is when you are finalizing your design outputs. So this is when you have your user interface specifications. If you have software in your device, this would be things like the UI design, graphical user interface design, documents, architectures, use flow diagrams, things like that. For hardware user interface, this is your front panel design, your button design, any labeling or stickers or icons that you use, handles, things like that. But these are the drawings and specifications for the design of your user interface. Don't forget about labeling and packaging. This is part of medical device design. So designing the artwork, the materials and things like that for the labeling as well as the packaging is also part of your user interface specifications. And then training. So if you have determined based on the risks and based on your use specification and your user groups that you do need to have training for your users, a training program, training materials, that is all considered part of the device design, and those are also design outputs. So we should have specifications for all of those drafted at this point as well. Once we have a design freeze, we've designed the device, we've done formative evaluations, we think we've got this nailed, then we do a design freeze and we enter verification and validation phase. Now this is where design validation comes in. Design validation is evaluation of the device design in actual or simulated use conditions with representative users. So this is where you use your use specification, where you define your user groups, your use environment, and this is where you use your risk analysis to determine use scenarios and what will need to be evaluated with a validation study. Remember, it includes not only the device design, but also the packaging and labeling and training. And your acceptance criteria for a summative study does come from the URRA, where you are defining your critical use steps based on the ones that can cause harm. So HF validation studies, within the protocol, you identify your user groups that you're evaluating and the sample sizes of those user groups. You want to include all user groups, including things like, even if it is supposed to be used by a doctor, and doctors are well trained and doctors use devices all the time, that doesn't mean that you're exempted from doing a summative study. Consider age groups and breaking them out into multiple cohorts of users, including, adults versus adolescents or children. Consider patients with and without experience potentially as different user groups. Like I said before, caregivers versus patients would be two different user groups. Reprocessing personnel, maintenance personnel, service personnel. These are all defined user groups, and all of them with critical tasks should be included in a summative study. The guidance currently still suggests at least 15 participants per user group will allow you to identify the majority of use errors that could lead to harm. So you have a protocol, you define your user groups, your sample sizes, you define the tasks that will be evaluated based on your task analysis from your use specification and the risks identified in the URRA. You go through this exercise within the protocol to ensure you have identified all critical versus essential tasks, and any task that you cannot observe during the study that you're designing, you should include knowledge tasks or knowledge-based questions. So make sure that even if you can't observe them doing it right or not doing it, if it's a critical task, there should be at least a knowledge question or some other sort of evaluation involved for those items as well. When you execute the study, you need to collect both observational and interview data. That means you are observing whether they do it right, and then you are asking them, did they do it right? If you observe that they conducted or they had a close call or a use difficulty or a use error, you should ask probing questions to ensure that you can get to the root cause of that close call, use difficulty, or use error, so that you can then, within the report, analyze all that data. It is not a quantitative analysis. It is very qualitative. You do it basically as a risk assessment based on the data that you gather during the study. What is the potential for harm? What mitigations have been in place? What was the root cause of the use errors and difficulties? And what are you going to do about them, if anything? That is all within the report. And then you go on to establish the residual risks and the acceptability thereof based on the controls that you have implemented. And then you also do a summary report for part of the HFE file. This wraps it all up with a nice bow. It summarizes all of the activities you did associated with your usability or human factors file. It repeats a lot of information potentially from other documents, but it summarizes it within here. It describes the user interface, it describes the product, it describes the risk assessments and the known use problems and all of that within the summary. keep in mind, I understand this seems repetitive and it seems like you're going to duplicate information all over the place in your DHF, but for the most part, when you're submitting this file, which is what this is for, the human factors file gets broken out and submitted to a different group within the FDA. They don't want to review the whole DHF. They don't want to see 15 different documents. They want to see protocols and reports for HF evaluations, and they want to see your summary report. And then if anything within that leads them to need to go review other things, they can ask. But to ease that breaking off of the HFE file review in a regulatory submission, that's why you do this way. And you summarize everything, including the validation, within your summary report. Yes. And then once the FDA reviews it, says, wow, you did a great job on your human factors file. We think this device is super safe and effective. Good job. Then you're marketing the device and selling it. And so you're in post-market surveillance stage. Just keep in mind the HFE file is part of your overarching design and development file, and the same rules apply. It is supposed to be kept current and accurate for the life of the product. So if you have customer complaints, if you have adverse events, if you decide based on this feedback loop that you need to make updates to the labeling, or you want to implement new training materials or things like that, those are new HF file deliverables. Those could impact risk assessments. So just ensure that during post-market surveillance, while you're doing these things, you are also looping everything back into your HF file. You are making the determination of the impact to the testing you've already done and whether it needs to be repeated. Maybe you need to do another usability study. Maybe you just need to add a warning somewhere and it doesn't require an additional usability study, but the impact should be evaluated and documented as part of any post-market surveillance and change control processes. Okay, so if you went through this whole process and within your use specification, part of the indication is that this device is available for reuse or multiple uses. It is reprocessed or re-sterilized, and you defined a user group of reprocessing personnel, and you likely have design outputs for reprocessing tasks like labeling, instructions, or training materials. And if your URA identifies that you have harms associated with those steps being done wrong or inappropriately, well, then you need to conduct human factors evaluations for the reprocessing process of your device. And you need to talk to the next presenter. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Christelle.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to talk more specifically about the reprocessing aspect of human factors testing. There will be a little bit of repeat in what Jessica said, but it does get a little bit more specific when we're talking reusable devices. So why does human factors testing matter on a reusable device? The biggest reason is safety. Reusable devices have their own unique set of expectations for ensuring that they're clean, disinfected, ready to be reused, and that it's safe for the next person that's going to use it, whether it's a different patient or the same patient over and over again. So safety is a big one. It's also going to reduce the risk of incorrect or inconsistent use. And then it will also allow the manufacturer to get insights into what may need to be changed before they put this on the market. So if you're doing your human factors testing with the user, you get a lot of insights on seeing if they can perform it correctly, seeing if they understand what the directions are asking them to do, and then potential insights on if they have the necessary requirements to even complete the process. Something that's really important to remember with this is that reprocessing steps are validated under their own submission. So under a 510(k) submission to the FDA, you do your reprocessing steps, you submit those, and you show that you prove those steps worked. And that's all good, but if you don't connect that with the user being able to do it correctly, you kind of void that assurance. So what to consider when you're thinking about what devices and what type of users you're going to have in a reprocessing human factors test is the device going to be used in a professional setting or a home care setting or a different setting? Are you going to be providing special training? Are you going to be providing education on the use of the device, maybe to the user or whoever's going to be helping the user with that product? Also consider the environment, like Jessica mentioned in her presentation. The environment is really important. If this is a home care type of device, are they going to have access to clean water all the time? Are they going to have time available to put in a bunch of time to reprocess this? Are they going to have the ability to properly store it? So you really have to think where the device is going to be used in all potential settings. You do need to consider the education and potential language barriers of the user. And then you need to consider if your reprocessing instructions are calling out anything specific, such as, do they need a washer disinfector in the hospital? Do they need a specific cleaning agent at home? Or do they need any kind of special brushes to make sure that they can clean all those areas that might be hard to reach? So just when you're designing the device, when you're thinking about who's going to be using it, these are all things that you just want to keep in the back of your mind. So I'm going to go over some findings and kind of what solidifies the need for reprocessing human factors. In 2024, APIC did a survey with hospitals and infection preventionists, and their data from that survey was pretty alarming. So over 1,000 IPs were surveyed, and nearly half of them confirmed that they had been cited during audits at the hospital for not following the IFU. And then almost all of them, around 820 IPs, confirmed that they had to reach out to the manufacturer to get clarification on the instructions for reprocessing. And then a big thing is that 80% of the hospital-acquired infections that are being seen in US hospitals are directly linked back to the medical device. So a lot of just really important data here on why the instructions matter and why the input from the user is really important on that as well. The main things that, again, these are from the IPs in the hospital. The main things that they provided in their survey were that the instructions in the IFU were too complex or too difficult to actually perform or too time consuming. They also talked about how the instructions maybe were written more to protect the lifespan of the device and not so much the prevention of hospital-acquired infections. And then they also confirmed a lack of clarity on the appropriate steps to clean the product. They also talked about chemicals or supplies that were called out in the IFU that would not be used in the hospital, or just that the process for cleaning or reprocessing the device didn't really follow the SPD flow. So when you're writing your IFU for reprocessing, when you're thinking about the design of your device and you're keeping the user in mind, you have to consider if your device is something that's going to take 30, 45 minutes to reprocess, that's going to be pretty disruptive to the SPD who's getting in cases and cases of reusable instruments that they have to process quickly. It also is going to hinder them if they have to question the what's being asked of them, or if they can't really understand what is expected. So again, with the human factors testing, you get all of those insights before you put that IFU on the market. The guidance documents that lead this, there's one primary and a draft. The primary one is applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices. This one really specifies who you need to include, how many people you should include, the environment you need to test in, and the use scenarios that you need to consider. So again, is it central sterile processing staff? Is it somebody who's going to use the device at home? Is it healthcare professionals in a clinical setting? So you also have to think about devices that are technically reusable, but they don't necessarily go back to be reprocessed in the SPD. So that's capital equipment, anything that's kind of a monitor where they're pushing buttons and that needs to be disinfected while the room is turned over. So consider clinical setting as well. And then there's a draft guidance, content of human factors information in medical device marketing submissions. This is a draft, but it does go along with that primary guidance, and it gives some additional insights into intended users and uses, environments, and training requirements. So if you don't plan on training the user in the real world, if you're not going into the SPD providing training to those users or providing training to a home user, the expectation is that you wouldn't do that in a human factors test. So it's outlining more specifics like that of what you can and can't do based on what you plan to do in the real world. And then I did also want to talk about TIR 55. This is not technically or officially recognized by the FDA. However, it's a consensus in the industry, and while they don't officially recognize it, they do expect that we're following it when we're testing. And this one also goes into more detail about, you know, the reprocessing has to be treated as part of the device's overall design. So you have to make sure that you're including that. You need to consider the capabilities and limitations of the user. Jessica also pointed on this. You know, based on the use of the device and what it's treating, is what you're asking them to do in reprocessing feasible? You do have to consider the environmental factors. Besides just, you know, access to water and where they might be, you have to consider what is the workload of an SPD? Do they have time to really follow these instructions? Equipment variety. If you're calling out something very specific in an IFU for reprocessing, maybe not every hospital or home has that. So definitely be conscious of that. And then you have to consider what they'll be, the environment that they'll be in. So if we're talking SPD, they're wearing layers of PPE, they're wearing 2 layers of gloves, they've got masks on, they've got a face shield. So you want to be aware of maybe limited visibility or dexterity that they'll have, and how we'll want to incorporate that into the testing. You also want to consider, like, are they in a loud environment? Can they hear if they need, if something, you know, you're asking them to push a button and listen for a sound. So you'll want to be aware of that as well. And then again, just being aware of the full cycle. So typically, if we're talking healthcare setting, there's a point of use treatment for a reusable device. Then there's the transport to SPD for reprocessing. Then there's the prep and storage for that. Then the delivery and prep for it being used again. So there really is a lot of steps that you have to think about through the whole human factors test. And then what do you really need to successfully perform a human factors test? You're going to need access to the right user groups, and you're going to need to be able to recruit and schedule them. So if you're trying to meet that requirement of 15 test participants, you're going to need access to quite a bit of SPD individuals. And then you're going to have to be able to recruit them in, pay them, and schedule them around their hospital shift. And you'll also need access to a representative setting. So if we're talking SPD, you need to be in an SPD setting. So you have your 3-bay sink, you've got your sonicators, automated washers if you need them, sterilizers, all of that equipment. You need somebody who's going to understand the full reprocessing life cycle so they can help you make sure that's part of your testing. So through the cleaning and packaging and everything, you might also need to consider, are they able to disassemble and reassemble in that? Are they able to put the tray back how it needs to be put before sterilization? So a lot of little things that need to be considered there. Support from reprocessing experts, that comes in handy when you're trying to figure out what all needs to be included in this and what doesn't need to be included. The lines between human factors testing and what falls into the reprocessing validation can get a little blurred. And then understanding how to use the data that you collected. Do you need to write up some risk assessments? Do you need to better define your failure modes? Do you need to make adjustments to your IFU? So that's really important for running a successful test. And the reason why it's kind of come out a lot more for Nelson Labs is because of our ability to support that. So just keep that in mind. And then, key takeaways. So human factor studies are going to be recommended for reprocessing medical devices. I think this is part of that full package that maybe gets overlooked. And then you'll just want to make sure you're keeping human factors and reprocessing in mind through the whole process of development.
Yeah, key takeaway primary should be, don't wait till the end to think about human factors. Consider it along the entire development process of your device. And don't forget about every single user group, because they all have different needs and they will all fail in different ways. Right. So if you have concerns about an HFE or UE file that you've been generating, or if you think there's gaps, or if regulators have noticed gaps in your HFE file, or if you waited till the end and are now in a bit of a spot, the RCA can help with that. We will help develop your HFE file as well as incorporate it into your overarching D&D file. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you need help.
Yep, and same here. If you have a medical device that needs reprocessing, whether it's healthcare or home use, you can reach out and we can help get that going for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica and Christelle, for your insights. We've learned some great information today, and you've given us a lot to think about. With that being said, we did receive some questions as you guys were going through your presentation that we'd like to address now. First and foremost, one of the questions that I can answer, we will not be providing the slides after this presentation, but we will be sending a recording out to everybody after we wrap up this and get it all up on our website. And it will be available on demand for free at both the RCA and Nelson Labs websites. And also, as again, a reminder on screen, if you'd like to reach out to either RCA or Nelson Labs, we obviously work very closely together, so you can reach out to one and we'll be connected with both. Also, if we don't get to your specific question today, we'll be happy to address those individually after we conclude. So the first question, does the acceptability of the URRA, is it the same as included in the risk management plan per ISO 14971?
I'm not sure I understand what we mean by acceptability. A URRA, if it's done specifically in the manner in which the FDA describes it, doesn't completely satisfy 14971 requirements. But if you feed it back into a larger risk analysis, risk evaluation, it can be used as part of your 14971 risk file as a use risk assessment. You need to ensure that you have within the URRA template all of the required aspects of a 14971 risk analysis evaluation. So I think the answer is yes and no. It's if your URRA is expansive enough, it can be a use-related or a use risk assessment compliant to 14971. But what the FDA specifically outlines in that guidance that Christelle was just talking about, the contents of, they lack a couple aspects of risk analysis that are required by 14971. So it depends on how you set it up. It can be, though.
All right. Next question here. Do I need a human factor study for a generic device? Is a human factor study for a generic device necessary despite having a CE mark?
It depends. The CE mark doesn't really mean much to the FDA. If your risk analysis determines you have critical tasks and you don't have any evidence that users can complete them without use error, you likely still need a study of some sort. There are cases in which you don't need a summative study, but those are pretty specific, and it relates mostly to changes in a device that you've already evaluated. Did I answer that, Brandon? Do you want to ask it again? I think there was potentially an aspect of that question I did not respond to.
Do you need a human factor study for a generic device? Is it necessary for a generic device despite having CE mark?
Okay, so generic meaning there's a predicate on the market that has already been for sale forever. This is really going to go back to what you can get the FDA to accept. I would suggest a pre-sub with a full human factors analysis, like complete most of the human factors aspects except for the summative study, and then say, based on all this information, we don't think we require a summative, and get the FDA to buy off on that. It's going to be related to the risks you've identified. It's going to be related to the potential for it to cause harm and any differences between the already approved version and the generic or subsequent versions. But it all goes back to harm. How much could it hurt somebody? And can you justify that? And can you get the FDA to buy off on it? It really varies depending.
All right, I think that was a pretty good answer for that. Next question here: how can we ensure with SPD human factors study expands across regions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what you would want to consider, if you know your regions, is the potential to get participants from each of those. And that's going to be the best bet, because you are going to want to consider if you're in the US versus if you're in Europe versus if you're in South America. It's going to vary.
Okay, thank you. And another question here. They say thank you for the nice presentation, and they want to see if you guys could comment on critical requirements for firmwares on HFE.
So firmware specifically isn't a thing unless it does it change the user interface in some way. I'm not sure how firmware would change the user interface design. What you're evaluating in human factors and the human factors engineering process is the use and user interface. So if changing the firmware changes the user interface, then it should be evaluated as a user interface design change, assess the risks, assess the impact, determine if additional testing is necessary. But a firmware update does not necessarily indicate a user interface design change, if that makes sense.
Okay. I've got a little bit of a follow-up from the last generic device question, despite having that CE mark. They're asking about in regards to registration to EU.
So the EU looks at human factors differently than the FDA. This mostly will relate to things like your clinical evaluation plan and what you can justify within your risk assessments. This is very much dependent on the relationship you have with your notified body and what they are comfortable with. It is entirely possible that your notified body will not require human factors evaluation for a generic device, but this is variable from notified body to notified body. Some are much more insistent on it than others. And again, it goes back to, how do you know it's safe? If you can justify and explain that it's still safe and it's exactly the same with very minimal changes, the EU is more favorable on that than the FDA.
Okay, yeah, and they gave a little bit more explanation here to try to focus it a little bit. If their product is reusable, but the generic device is disposable, they're wondering if they need human factor study or a literature evaluation, despite that CE certification.
We're getting a little too
Yeah.
specific here to understand without really seeing the differences, the entire DHF. Like in this type of instance, if a client came to us and asked these questions, I would say, we got to see the DHF. We've got to review your entire design file. Let's see what you've got. Let's see what we can reasonably justify and explain to know the answer to that. I don't think either of us could answer that. It's a little too specific without knowing all the background.
Please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to jump on a call and take a deeper dive. For the next question here, what is the most difficult part of setting up human factors testing for reprocessing?
Usually the most difficult part is finding the users and recruiting them. It can be tough when you're needing specific user groups, such as individuals from SPD, to get in the door and get their attention and bring them in. So yeah, I would say the most difficult part is recruiting the user.
I'd like to chime in on that, not specifically about reuse human factor studies, but human factor studies in general, recruiting representative users and clearly defining user groups and ensuring you've defined all user groups is definitely one of the most challenging parts about actually executing human factor studies across the board, whether it's end use, reprocessing, any of it, because you have to have access to people who meet your user group definitions. And finding those people, recruiting adequate numbers of them, and developing relationships with them it's a whole business in and of itself.
Okay, great. Another question just rolled in here. When making a design change to further mitigate a risk, what are some of the human factors requirements that you need to think about?
So is this design change a user interface design change? Question one. If it changes some aspect of the user interface of the device, you want to loop that all the way back to what does it change for the requirement? What does it change for the output? What does it change for the risks associated with that input or output? Does it increase risk or decrease risk? If it is a mitigation that you are implementing to decrease a risk that you have already identified, should we do a human factors evaluation to confirm it is effective at reducing that risk? That is really the key. Design changes intended to reduce a specific risk that has already been identified will typically require some human factors evaluation to verify it was effective in mitigating that risk. It might not be a full summative, but some evaluation with representative users in a representative use environment to confirm that the change you've made did what it was supposed to do.
Great answer. Next up here, are there non-reusable medical devices that benefit from reprocessing human factors testing?
There are. So if you're thinking about the reprocessing setting and technically medical devices, but they don't need reprocessing, you're probably thinking about PPE. And so there are times where it makes sense for a human factors test to be held for PPE. If you're concerned about the user properly donning and doffing, or if there's any other kind of unique aspect to the PPE that you want to confirm, the user gets right, otherwise they're not protected. Those kind of details, then you would benefit from a human factors test.
Awesome. Another question here. Do all medical devices need a human factors file? And are there any circumstances where you don't need a summative study?
If your device is subject to design controls, your device is subject to a human factors file. So like low risk class 1 devices where you don't even have to have a full D&D file, likely HF is not necessary. But if you have a design and development file, if you have risks, if it's anything other than a low risk class 1 device, yes, you need to have a human factors file. Cases where you don't need a summative study are widely varied. Again, the FDA decides what they want to see from what. But in general, if you've already done a human factors evaluation on a device and you're making a change to it, and you can do a comparative analysis or a threshold analysis, it's some kind called, then you can skip a summative study. That is one thing codified in guidance, that if you can compare it to something you have already studied and you can evaluate the differences and determine the risks associated with those differences, agencies will accept a comparative analysis in those cases rather than a repeat summative. Otherwise, it's whatever you can get the FDA to agree to, or your notified body.
Awesome. And with that question, I think we'll end there. We're getting right up to the end of the hour here. So thank you, Jessica and Christelle, for all of that information in presenting today. And I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for attending this session. We hope you found it valuable, and thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.